Thank you for choosing Tox News, your one and only source to anarcho-authoritarianism, coming to your front door. Oh boy. That is the name of the title of the episode. Theory Thursday is pushed back until next Thursday, just to make sure all the ribbons and bows are tied neatly on top. But for today, we got two Tucker Carl segments, and they're back-to-back days. You got yesterday with the Democratic Party is planning a war on half of America, and last night, just a few hours ago, Party in Power is demonizing half of the country. So, the right-wing echo chamber is heavily ramping up their oppressed feels. They feel oppressed now that Donnie Trump Jr. is out of the White House. I mean, there's a lot of times that they felt oppressed even with Don in the White House, but now is the time for them to really play victim now that they have actually a minority representation in the federal government. So, no Militia Watch weekly update this week either. They haven't made an update. I'm sure it's either due to massive events or just the inauguration and everything like that, so we don't have that just yet. And the Theory Thursday will be back next week. Chapter 3, what was it? A Day in the Life of Adam and Eve, I believe is Chapter 3. But for today, it's all Tucker Carlson. So strap yourselves in. We're getting a lot of rants. The thing I find fascinating about Tucker Carlson is like his position isn't to deliver any news whatsoever, but to actually steer a narrative. Like, he is one of the most blatant of avoiding any objective news reporting and actually telling his viewers what and how to feel. And that's what we're getting into today. So let's dive face first. Oh, seems that's not looking good, so I'll just go to the main view. All right, let's get it.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. It's weird to say it, but this is the last day of the Trump administration. If you supported Donald Trump, that's a sad thing to face after 4 years. On the other hand, if you didn't support Donald Trump, if you're one of the many in our professional class who have made hating Donald Trump the very center of your life, this has got to be a pretty good day for you. You won. Your party now has control of everything. By tomorrow afternoon, Donald Trump will be gone.
I mean, the sad thing here is that he's lumped like everybody who was against Trump as if they're pro-Biden, and that's not the case here at Tox News. Hopefully, I'll get more news segments to criticize exactly what Joe Biden is doing. His lack of awareness going on at the southern border. In his first 100 days, he did try to enforce more of DACA protections, the deferred arrivals, child arrivals, deferred action for child arrivals. He did reinforce that, even though Donald Trump had weakened it pretty heavily. But as far as like improving the material conditions of the asylum seekers at the border who had suffered under the Trump administration and his xenophobic policies, no action has been taken towards that whatsoever. But again, this is technically day 2 of his, at the time of recording of Biden's presidency. But from last I had heard, there isn't going to be that big of fundamental changes on that specific issue. So I'm not really that excited for Biden's administration. Also reported is that they are going to back Juan Guaido in Venezuela. And Juan Guaido back in 2019 attempted to overthrow the elected government. Now, I'm not a Maduro fan either, but I'm not into like powerful, influential people subverting elections in order to, get their own power. So not a supporter of Guaido, not a supporter of Maduro, but I'm also not a supporter of U.S.-backed coups. So that's another point of contention between me and Biden. Also, he doesn't support Medicare for all. That's a pretty big one for me. And Biden is almost like Pete Buttigieg, where he's like Medicare for all who want it. but yeah, he's Tucker Carlson is lump sumping everybody who was anti-Trump as pro-Biden, when only that was just to get Trump out of office for a lot of people.
For good. You got exactly what you wanted. You should be thrilled about that. You ought to be celebrating. But they're not celebrating. That's the remarkable thing. No one in the Democratic Party seems happy tonight. They're angrier than ever. Instead of taking victory laps, they are plotting revenge against the people they just beat.
What?
They're thinking of new ways to injure and humiliate and degrade their political opponents, make it impossible for them to work again, throw them in jail, destroy their lives. It's hard to describe how weird and strange and awful this is to watch. Imagine winning a tennis match in straight sets, then immediately leaping over the net and smashing your opponent in the face with your racket. It wasn't enough for you to win. You had to inflict physical pain. You couldn't be happy until another human being screamed in agony.
What?
What kind of person would do that?
What?
What kind of people are
like,
watching?
What? Can he provide an example for this analogy? It's like, what? Oh man, there's nothing to address there. It's just so ridiculous. All right.
Watching now, the kind of people who are even more vicious when they win. The leaders of the Democratic Party have now decided that 74 million Trump voters weren't just wrong or misguided. They didn't simply back the wrong guy or have incorrect opinions or fail to see the obvious truths. No, the threat they pose is graver and more serious than that, more dangerous. These 74 million Trump voters are, in fact, terrorists. They're a looming physical...
Well, so Tucker Carlson there is doing the work for CNN and MSNBC. But I don't think everybody there is a bit of divide with the liberals on this, but I personally don't believe that everybody who was there at the Capitol necessarily intended to participate in an insurrectionist coup, willing to kidnap elected officials, possibly killing them or hanging or having them in some kind of banana republic court. I don't think every single person that was there had that intent, but that's not to say that there weren't people there with that intent. We've gone over this in the previous episode. But the 74 million Americans don't necessarily tell me that they're all terrorists. Not even all 74 million voters probably supported the insurrection. But the 74 million, what it does tell us is that Trump's campaign of misinformation and introduction into neo-fascist authoritarianism in the United States was acceptable to 74 million Americans. So it's not necessarily it's not just the act of the insurrection that apparently we have the issue with 74 million people supporting Donald Trump. It's much grander than that. It's the entire presidency. Because if people voted for Trump just based off of his 2020 actions, that's actually far worse, rather than actually supporting him throughout his entire presidency. But his entire presidency was a highlight of a man who wanted to concentrate executive power, and he even went around saying how Article 2 allows him to do whatever he wants, when Article 2 really just highlights that the president has full executive power, but he tried to increase the amount of power that the executive branch would have. You see? And that's the issue. I mean, George Bush was the same thing. Obama didn't really rein in the executive powers either. Executive orders have been increasing with each president as we keep going on. So it's not necessarily the terrorist thing that I have an issue with. I don't watch too much MSNBC or CNN, so I don't know if they're sitting there on there constantly calling all Trump supporters terrorists. But they're at least sympathetic to a bit of authoritarianism, especially if it represents their American exceptionalist and American traditionalist values.
Physical threat to the rest of us, and we must deal with them in the way that you deal with threats like that, existential threats to the nation. Saddam Hussein, al-Baghdadi, Kim Jong-un, Donald...
So that was a thing that was brought up by Meghan McCain, who's a Republican Party member. But she said that she was cool with, and she said this on The View, and I don't know why The View is political, but like she said that she was okay with sending all of them to Gitmo. Not okay with Gitmo here on Tox News. Gitmo needs to go. There's no reason that we need to have a private island so that we can do things like torture methods or techniques that we can't do in the United States. It seems a bit hypocritical to be like, well, it's not in the United States, although that is a territory of the United States. Skirt, 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 loophole, loophole. But like, it's, I don't know how we really begin to reach across the aisle with people, with the 74 million voters for Donald Trump, because the right-wing media seems to get them to dig in further into either supporting Trump or just being anti-left, because they're constantly marking this idea that they're not trying to, like, the liberals aren't trying to get you to compromise, but trying to get you to submit. So, with the right-wing echo chamber growing every day, it's really hard to find wiggle room and compromise with people who don't necessarily want that. So I am all for de-radicalizing as many of the Trump supporters as we possibly can, but there's a very complex web of traditional values and ideas of what America is that is going to take us, I don't know, maybe even decades to try and undo the damage. But like I've said, we have the right-wing echo chamber it is a bit more reactionary to us reversing those damages. So, it's an incredibly uphill battle, especially with the further left that you go in the political spectrum of the United States. Like I myself, I identify as an anarchist and a socialist, and I can't really put a concrete term on there because it's still a lot of working theory, but I definitely see myself more on the anarchist socialist side. I am definitely down at this point of the American economy that we're at to move into a market socialist model for the economy. But trying to even achieve that market socialism, even though we have all the resources and tools to start building that economic infrastructure, is a big hill to climb, massive hill to climb. And so with the right constantly building that hill at the same time to make it more difficult for left-wing movements to be successful, it's very difficult, and it's getting much, much harder. So I personally see the Biden administration as a time to highlight the fact that neoliberalism isn't much better than Trump's authoritarianism, or even Trumpism, if we're going to put that on there. But that we need to start looking at better answers that we haven't necessarily tried before. Some answers we did implement back in the Great Depression, such as Social Security and the welfare programs, but it kind of needs to expand well beyond that, to the point where the government isn't necessarily the thing keeping people dependent, but is fully protecting their rights, especially if the right to food, to shelter, and to healthcare. The rest of it, we can start building on trying to create equality of outcomes, even though that's nearly impossible, but at least starting with a base level equality of opportunity where everybody has the same access to the basic necessities. That creates the fertile soil of equality of opportunity. So this is a giant uphill battle for me, because the Republicans want people to move further to the right in order to compromise. The liberals want them to move a little to the center to compromise, to say, hey, we need to at least provide some things to the most vulnerable in the working class. Not everything. We need to keep them subsistent so that at least they'll go into the job market. But we need to provide enough so that they're not dying before going into the job market, is basically neoliberalism. But yeah, big battle for leftists in America. We're a country 250 years old who's been trying the same thing for over that entire period. So getting to a new level is going to be, I'm exhausted just thinking about it, honestly. But long tangent for barely 2 minutes into this video.
Donald Trump's voters. For years, they told us this country had been infiltrated by Russian spies, but now we know it's worse than that. The real threat, the actual enemy, is within. In the end, it always is. 74 million deviationists lurk in our midst. They look like normal people, But ladies and gentlemen, do not be deceived. They are Trotskyites. They're wreckers, kulaks. We must root them out. It'll take a war to do that, an actual war, a war on our...
Oh man, he literally just dove right head first into that McCarthyism. Like this is exactly it. That if you can't necessarily build a coalition that's anti-democrat, you can at least take it to the extent where you're anti-leftist in general, where you hear socialism, you hear communism, you hear anarchism, and you instantly think the destruction of everything you know and love. That's what that is. That's what that is. So if like beating down Biden doesn't work, equating him to the furthest left aspects or people of this country would do just fine.
Own people. To make that point as clear as possible, the Democratic Party has marshaled military leaders to deliver the news. They're the party's spokesman now. General Stanley McChrystal is among them. McChrystal, in case you don't remember, is the strategic genius who can take credit, if you can call it that, for running the longest losing war in American history, the one in Afghanistan, the war that's still going. Yesterday, McChrystal took a break from collecting fat corporate directors' fees to note that, based on his extensive experience...
This is such hogwash bullshit. And, like, if you go back to 2001 or 2004, like, from 2004 to 2008, Fox News was basically building the idea that we need to be in Afghanistan and we need to be in Iraq. So this is a bunch of hogwash bullshit. This is malarkey at its finest. Like, it only serves them now to be anti-war because most of the population at this point is against the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, which we have pulled out in neither. But like if you go back further enough, you'll see CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, you'll see them all coalesce underneath the military industrial complex and fight for the idea that we need to invade these countries, which actually had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. So this is just convenience for Tucker Carlson at this point.
Mismanaging America's foreign policy, Trump voters look an awful lot like terrorists, an awful lot. Quote, I did see a similar dynamic in the evolution of al-Qaeda in Iraq, McChrystal said, where a whole generation of angry Arab youth with very poor prospects followed a powerful leader who promised to take them back to a time, to a better place. And he led them to embrace an ideology that justified their violence. This is now happening in America. Al-Qaeda in America. Thanks, Stan. Sometime when you can manage to spare a moment from getting rich from your failures in America's decline, we'd love to know exactly what did happen in Afghanistan. What went wrong there when you have time?
That's funny that he would do that, but he actually didn't bring him on to defend himself. Now, another highlight here is how he brought up that this army general got rich while America was in decline, even though we see like massive wealth gaps happening in the private sector like right now. Like the Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, like the top earners earned more during the pandemic when most Americans were suffering than they have in a long time. Like 2020 was the biggest transfer of wealth since 2008. So it's not necessarily even just these wars on terrors that are making people rich, specifically the arms developers or arms manufacturers. But like also every time we go through a recession or a depression, we seem to also move all of our wealth into the pockets of fewer and fewer people. So, I think another highlight here is that Tucker Carlson is ignoring the actual movements of militia, which are far closer to Al-Qaeda, and they were there at the Capitol riot. So, the convenience of ignoring the existence of militia groups at that riot allows him to paint the idea that Democrats are after the normal average Trump supporter. That's not necessarily true. There are various militia groups that are bolstering themselves for further confrontation, and they are much closer to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, especially with their beliefs of American exceptionalism, ultranationalism, and fundamentalist beliefs all wrapping themselves in together. It really doesn't separate them that much from ISIS. So, but you're not getting a full in-depth overview of all the participating actors in the Capitol riots and it's convenient for Tucker Carlson because the viewer is less likely to be a part of those militias and is more likely just to be a Republican. So he's using the militia's actions to make Republicans more sympathetic to the crackdown on anybody who would be considered an insurrectionist or quite possibly a terrorist. There were pipe bombs found outside the DNC and the RNC. So he's obviously obfuscating and avoiding that discussion.
Until then, though, Andy McCabe would like to put a finer point on the matter. You remember Andy McCabe. He's the former high-level FBI official who was canned for lying and corruption, a model federal employee. So when Andy McCabe speaks, you could hear the moral authority in his voice, gravelly and resonant like cigarette smoke. You're going to want to listen carefully to what Andy McCabe has to say. According to Andy McCabe's considered judgment, Donald Trump's voters are very much like ISIS. Listen to this.
When we looked at those Americans...
And, I want to clarify, make sure that this is clear, that I don't think every Trump supporter is much closer to ISIS. I think the militia groups themselves, who are mobilizing as we speak, that's why I do the weekly updates from Militia Watch, they are much closer to Al-Qaeda, they are much closer to ISIS, and the more and more, it's good now that they don't have a president that supports and, I don't know, even comforts them, like their existence being around, but, at this point now, they feel that they have a domestic enemy in the position of power, and so that is probably going to further more events of stochastic terrorism. Stochastic terrorism was still pretty active during the Trump era, but under Biden, they feel that they are already being dominated and conquered by their enemy or their political opponents. So I could see it increasing more. If Biden does do a national lockdown due to the coronavirus and its new variant that seems to be more infectious, I have no idea at that point what militia groups are going to do.
Who traveled to Syria for the purpose of joining the Islamic State. When you put all those faces and names down in one place, you had doctors, lawyers. Some people are very vulnerable to and drawn into that core lie of any extremist movement, and that is exactly what we're seeing now with this particular group of Trump supporters.
Wait, American national security official Andy McCabe is telling us they're like ISIS, Islamic State in Syria? Aren't those the wild-eyed lunatics who beheaded journalists and set all those people on fire and then videotaped themselves doing it? Wow, that's terrifying. That's right, Mr. and Mrs. America.
I mean, but you have to wonder because there was the guy there, full body armor, pistol on his side, zip tie handcuffs, and it was a pile of zip tie handcuffs. So you had the QAnon shaman leave a note for former Vice President Mike Pence saying justice is coming. These things don't happen in a vacuum and aren't just going to subside because the FBI is arresting people. Like Hitler threw a coup back in 1923, but didn't have power until 1933. So, yeah, these are building blocks. This isn't just happening in some vacuum where events pop in and pop out. These are building blocks of something from the past and continuing on into the future. So most of them haven't made it to the level of ISIS, either because they don't have the recruitment numbers or they haven't taken the direct action towards political violence. But this isn't just going to stop. And his obfuscation of the events is going to further the plausible deniability of other militia groups and actions. Is that a knock on my door? No? All right.
What we didn't tell you before was that ISIS was for Donald Trump. That's why they were murdering so many people. They were the Syrian branch of MAGA. You may have heard it was some...
I mean, I had heard that... I don't think ISIS endorsed Donald Trump, but Al-Qaeda did. No, the Taliban. The Taliban. Let me see. I don't think ISIS endorsed Trump, but they could have. But I remember... No, the Taliban. Yeah, that's who it was. There is an old article from when Trump was elected saying ISIS reacts to President-elect Donald Trump. So just out of curiosity, I do want to see. When Donald Trump was elected president, social media sites associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda celebrated Trump's victory. Ooh. Rejoice with support from Allah and find glad tidings in the imminent demise of America at the hands of Trump, wrote the one ISIS-related outlet. Yeah, fuck yeah.
Kind of Islamic thing. Come on, that's racist. It was Donald Trump all along.
But it was in the 2020 election that Trump was endorsed by Taliban, which is a group in Al-Qaeda, which I think he even had negotiations with them to seize power alongside with the other representatives in Afghanistan's government. So that's interesting. I mean, you know, throughout the 60s and 90s, we did work with various groups in the Middle East, such as Al-Qaeda, Taliban, you know, what was once known the Mujahideen. I think we've, not Boko Haram, we haven't helped them. We've helped other insurgency groups throughout the Middle East in order to further American interests in the Middle East. So, you know, our ties to extremist groups have been shown before, but you know, highlighting every single Trump supporter as a member of ISIS, no. But the militia groups themselves are much closer, much closer. And I'm talking about Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, Sons of Liberty. There's many more. There's hundreds of militia groups inside the United States, and yeah, those are the ones we really need to be wary of, because the Trump supporters, average Republicans, will show up for these protests, but that is only to give strength in numbers to the militia groups who will actually take further action, most likely.
Now, those people are in this country, in Dallas and Sarasota and Newport Beach, everywhere. They're hiding in plain sight. God knows what they will do next.
Yeah, and I mean, dozens of National Guard troops were removed from their duty to protect Joe Biden and hold the D.C. lockdown during the inauguration because of their ties to militia groups. Same thing has been happening inside the police. Certain police members have been fired or resigned because of their alignment with Three Percenters and various others. There's a group out in California within the police that call themselves the Executioners. So there are extremists, and they are everywhere. I'm not saying that, you know, it could be your neighbor and you should report them to the feds. I'm not trying to create another McCarthy era, but people need to be aware of their symbols and their actions. And again, that's why we cover those weekly updates in Militia Watch whenever they come out.
Actually, we do know another 9/11. That's what they're planning. And that's why we need a new 9/11 commission to root them out. But thankfully, Commander Pelosi is planning one right now. Watch.
There is strong interest in the Congress in a 9/11 type commission.
A deep look in a 9/11 style commission to really get to all of what happened.
Yeah, they need.
And I'm not really sure that this is a great idea, because it can be used on literally any, you know, movement, even if it's like a left-wing peaceful movement. Like, you know, you've seen how the federal troops reacted to protesters in Portland. Now, what would happen if it was made much easier to designate them as a terrorist group? Their civil rights would be stripped away almost instantaneously. So, not really sure how we're going to create a commission that isn't going to further harm dissent against the country. Terrorist attacks, of course, are you know, a level of dissent that is reached, like, yeah, it's condemnable because it's political violence that tends to take innocent lives. But when it comes to just regular protest movements that may eventually devolve into property damage, I don't think we should use the same essentially banhammer against people who destroy property without taking lives, and people who intentionally go out to cause as much violence as they possibly can. I don't think that's ever been a part of the BLM movements. They're more about systemic change than they are about, you know, creating chaos in order to prop up a new regime. I think right-wing militias are more into that, especially since Trump was hoping that their actions would overturn the election results on January 6th.
9/11 type commission of inquiry.
Along the lines of a 9/11 commission.
A 9/11 type commission.
And hopefully an independent 9/11 style commission will look at.
I think this is a big enough threat, an attack on the center of our democracy, that it's going to need a look that spans branches of government, something closer to a 9/11 commission.
Well, I think we know they're on the same email chain, but that doesn't change the substance of what they just told you. Did you hear Jim Comey, another noted moral authority? What Jim Comey told you is that what happened in Washington on January 6th, the Chewbacca guy stumbling around the House floor and all of it, that was this generation's 9/11. And in fact, the magnitude of that atrocity begs for a better name. So from now on, we're going to call it 1/6. And that day will live in infamy for all time. Your grandchildren will get the day off from school every January 6th in remembrance of the horror that took place. In fact, here's a better idea. Let's call it Insurrection Day, because honestly, that's what it was.
The president incited an insurrection against Congress to prevent the peaceful transition of power.
And then he sat back and watched the insurrection.
Insurrection, a violent mob.
You know, it was a unsuccessful and quite inept insurrection, but it was one nonetheless. So, you know, we can say even though they didn't capture anybody that was an elected official, and the only people that died were 2 cops and 3 protesters. The action in itself was a subversion of our democracy, and was it ended up breaking the integrity of the government across like multiple lines. So it was an insurrection, though it was weak and quite unsuccessful in whatever it was really trying to achieve. It was, and it happened. And it needs to be acknowledged. Tucker Carlson trying to downplay it here just because there was a guy dressed up in a costume, even though that guy has quite a big influence in the QAnon movement, which the QAnon movement is completely devolved from reality. Like, I am genuinely worried about the actions that they might take because they believe that Democrats are shape-shifting demons that rape children. Some of them might be, but like, honestly, like deep down to the core, it truly ignores any of our systemic issues in the name of this like hyperbolic, non-existent myth of what Democrats are doing, rather than the actual systemic problems that hurt the most disaffected, disenfranchised, and working class citizens of this country. It doesn't do anything systemically, and if you allow them to hang a bunch of Democrats in the town square, who are they allowing? Who would they allow to take power, and almost absolute power? And at the time of QAnon, before Trump lost, it was Trump. Trump was their messiah. He was the second coming of Jesus. So you can make fun of the QAnon shaman because of his, eccentric dressing, but that guy has a bit of influence in the community that he participates in, which has dangerous beliefs. So play him down as much as you want, Tucker Carlson, but you have to acknowledge that it's a cult that exists right now, constantly evolving, changing their beliefs and their actions.
A white supremacist president who incited a white supremacist insurrection.
An insurrection against our government.
The violent attack on the U.S. Capitol was an act of insurrection.
The insurrection that violated the sanctity of the people's capital.
This was not a protest. This was an insurrection.
Bruce Willis in Insurrection Day. But it's not a joke. According to the Honorable Jim McGovern and everyone else you just saw on the screen, this was not a protest. How dare you call it that? This was an insurrection. Insurrection, insurrection, insurrection. Write that 100 times on the board, and don't forget it. INSURRECTION. Insurrection. Learn it. Love it. But you should also know, by the way, for frame of reference, what an insurrection is not. For example, yesterday, 28 people.
The definition of insurrection is a violent uprising against an authority or government. 2 police officers died. That's violence against the government, technically. They destroyed public property, which, thanks to Trump's executive order, would give them 10 years in federal prison. Even though it already was a crime to destroy federal property. Trump made sure that people who did so would get 10 years. So there was a crime, there was violence, and it was technically an uprising against elected officials and the election itself. But because the Ames goals ultimately failed, Tucker Carlson has this ability to downplay the whole actions. If you don't think it was an insurrection, it's probably due to the fact that there wasn't that much violence. And when you compare it to other nations, such as third world countries, there tends to be much more violence with machine gun fire, bombing, and all of that. But this insurrection in itself was almost heat of the moment and disorganized. Although, like I said, there were militia members there intending to do far more things. Now, Governor Whitmer in Michigan had a plot against her by the Wolverine Watchmen to kidnap her. That is not going to be the last attempt by a militia to attack an elected official. So him downplaying it and ignoring the events in Michigan, it allows he's basically providing cover for the militia groups as if they don't even exist. And that secrecy and that darkness allows them to grow completely unopposed.
Arrested at a violent protest in New York, not on behalf of Donald Trump. Those people attacked police officers. A bunch of them went to jail. But know this.
And then he just lied about that protest. It was a workers' protest to try and get $1 an hour raise. And the police did what the police does best, and they busted that union. They tear gas, rubber bullet. They charged at the protesters. Tucker Carlson, of course, 180ing that story to put cops in the limelight as the victims of that, when really it was a protest movement in order to increase workers' wages by $1 per hour, honestly. And the cops crushed it in the name of capital. So.
Were they insurrecting at the time? No, they weren't. How do we know they weren't? Because they weren't racists.
No, because they didn't storm the Capitol with the intent of getting any elected officials or sending a message. There wasn't a violent uprising against an authority or government. It was a protest, which was then answered by violence from the government or authority.
Racists can insurrect. Listen carefully to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley explain.
The threat of white supremacy looms large, and it is tragic that it took this insurrection and this attempt to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power, and moreover, injury and loss of life, for many to appreciate just how formidable the threat of white supremacy is.
This is a
well, and the thing is that you have to highlight that, when the Black Lives Matter protests happened in Washington at the Capitol, they instantly had the National Guard all geared up instantly there. That shows a little bit bias towards what kind of movements they're willing to stamp out almost immediately. Whereas with the Capitol riots, they only had DC Capitol Police almost in regular gear to stop the protesters from doing what they did, which obviously the police failed in their attempt to block the protesters from the Capitol. They should have had the National Guard there almost instantly. And that there shows a little bit of the dichotomy between the white supremacist movements, even though I don't want to focus in just that this was just an act of white supremacy. I think it was much more an act of authoritarianism, the desire by a lot of citizens in this country to want an authoritarian. But, Trump does provide a bit of comfortability for the white supremacists and his immigration policies, and his ignorance of the Black Lives Matter movement definitely, it elated the white supremacists. It emboldened them. They like it, but he wasn't like a full-on Woodrow Wilson type of white supremacist president. So, focusing on that, I think, is just, almost like a bit of class reductionism or just reductionism to say that it was mostly white supremacy fueling all of this when, it had a part to play, but it wasn't all that. It's this desire of authoritarianism that really drove people in there to fight for Donald Trump.
Tough one. So what do you do with insurrectionists like that? Insurrectionists who were also white supremacists, as they always are, but not, and here's the tricky part, in some cases even white. So you have non-white white supremacists who insurrect. That's very tough. How do you handle them? Simple force doesn't always work. These are hard cases. You need to re-educate people like that, possibly in camps, re-education camps.
Here we go. here we go. The victimhood comes in, and we covered this in the right-wing echo chamber, that like they're really trying to focus in on this idea that they want to throw Republicans into re-education camps and deprogram them away from that, when really we need to de-radicalize Republicans away from Trump. I don't like the Republican Party whatsoever, so if we could get more people away from that party in general, cool beans, good work. But ultimately, what we really need to do is bring the heightened level of certain Trump supporters down a peg and realize that Donald Trump really didn't even care about them. And I feel like that is a good way to start de-radicalizing people away from the idea that an authoritarian can protect the country. It'll protect the system and the powers that be and the status quo ultimately, but it won't actually help anybody in the working class.
If you will, you must deprogram them for the safety of the rest of us. Thankfully, Sandy Cortez has been thinking about this for quite some time. Indeed, since she was a child growing up in leafy Westchester County. Some little girls played with dolls, but Sandy Cortez put her Barbies in a secure enclosure and re-educated them because they were thinking bad things. Forbidden.
He just made that up. Like, why? Like, why?
Hidden things. So Sandy Cortez knows exactly what to do now.
We had a program addressing white supremacists, that we had programs, federal programs, that went towards funding organizations like these that de-radicalized people. And President Trump pulled the plug on federal funding for some of these programs. And so one thing that we know is that we have to get that funding right back up, and we probably need to double, triple, quadruple, or increase funding for these de-radicalization programs.
And I think what she's referencing there is when Trump attacked the critical race theory training, because like trying to understand how racist biases, either implicit or explicit, can affect the opportunities of many citizens in this nation. So I think that's what she's referencing there. And like the last thing that Trump did was, or his administration was, release the 1776 report, which said that the criticizing of American founding fathers for their racism does more damage than their actual racism, even though their racism has damaged 13% of this population for over 200 years. So, Trump did do some stuff that was emboldening to the white supremacist movement, but I think that's because they're more willing to fight for that authoritarianism than most regular Republicans are. Most regular Republicans will support it in the sight of danger. Like anytime that a country really starts to degrade, they'll go over to this messiah that will save them from all of these existential crises. But the white supremacist movement is the one that is probably most willing to do political violence in order to ensure the success of that authoritarian. So there a lot of moving parts here.
Barbie, bad Barbie, bad Barbie. Those are naughty thoughts. This federal program will deprogram you.
He's a psycho. He's literally a psycho. He thought that up more than AOC actually did that. He's crazy.
So you listen to that and all of this, and you realize the totalitarian instinct is always the same. Always. Only the names of the dictators change. First, you strip people of their right to speak out loud honestly. Then you prevent them from defending themselves and their families. And then, because you now can, you force them at gunpoint to read your catechism, to accept your orthodoxy. You wonder if Sandy Cortez plans to make Trump voters sign written statements of...
I mean, that's not true either. Like the whole thing is that, the study that came out saying that if, a viewer watches Fox News is less informed than somebody who doesn't consume news at all. Tucker Carlson's lawyer argued in court that Tucker Carlson wouldn't be taken seriously by any informed person whatsoever. So there is a bit of deprogramming and de-radicalization that needs to happen. And apparently it comes with holding Tucker Carlson accountable for his misinformation, disinformation, and his ability to weave narratives that serve a political agenda. This is so wild. He continues going on because he would be most affected by the 9/11 Commission in its early form. But he also does play a little bit on the horseshoe theory here, that like the further left that you go, the more authoritarianism that you will get, and the same thing if the right. And ultimately down to like true politics here, like if you go further left, there's a horizontal hierarchical system that you eventually want to achieve. I don't think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants to achieve that. I'm not sure she's like a true socialist. She's definitely a democratic socialist that wants to reform the system in order to provide more for the working class and the most vulnerable of this nation. But she doesn't want to see, I don't think, at least from most public appearances, that she wants to see a whole reformation of the economic and political system in a more socialist ideal. But Tucker Carlson, he's crazy. He's crazy. That's but he's building that victimhood to be exploited, essentially.
Affirming they have been deprogrammed, of course. That's always part of the process. The scary thing is that's where we're heading. Sandy Cortez and her friends are no longer a fringe element within the Democratic Party. Joe Biden ran as a moderate. People voted for him because they thought he was. But Joe Biden's victory was really a victory for Sandy Cortez and that part of the Democratic Party. They are closer now than they've ever been to taking control. The reason for that is very simple. There is a massive power vacuum at the center of this incoming administration, the one that takes power tomorrow. Joe Biden is fading. That is not a personal attack on Joe Biden. It is real.
It's kind
Joe
of
Biden
a
is not
personal
capable
attack.
of running the government or of pushing back against the radicals in his party. The people around Joe Biden know this very well, and that includes people very close to him, including his relatives. People who love Joe Biden were upset when he ran for president. They know he can't do the job, and they are very worried about what happens next. That is not speculation. They have said so out loud. And no honest person in Joe Biden's orbit will deny this. So the question is, who will fill the power vacuum?
If no one would deny it, why wouldn't you provide like proof? Why not cite your source? Like, he gets away with that so often, to create like these hypothetical situations that are vaguely true but not necessarily full context. That's so Carlson.
Vacuum within the Biden administration. There are still, and we're being as honest as we can be, there are still reasonable people within the Democratic Party. There are people who have a stake in this country, people who don't want to destroy it. And now is the time for those people, the reasonable people in the Democratic Party, to step up forcefully.
But here's the thing, is that if you listen to like Joe Biden's slogan, "Build Back Better," that's almost being like Trump was a degradation of the status quo, almost a devolvement of it, because it was so authoritarianism that it didn't respect a lot of certain institutions that were meant to check and balance each other. But Biden's answer is to build back better. His idea is to go back to the status quo, and then for the status quo to thrive and supposedly continue uplifting people out of poverty, even though the trend has been on the decline for decades now, since the Reagan era. And Reagan was really the first rampant neo-lib to ever hold office. But like, yeah, just even in his slogan, "Build Back Better," is something of, let's achieve the status quo and then build from there, which, the status quo in itself is exactly what gave us Trump. So ridiculous. What a ridiculous claim.
And call off the war their party is planning on millions of fellow Americans. And it is war they're planning. A 9/11 commission, blanket censorship, mass arrests, deprogramming. These are not...
and the censorship comes from the stories that we covered last 2 episodes, but it isn't necessarily with the corporations and the government coming together and fighting against Republicans. It's just part of the fact that Republicans have been the biggest distributors of misinformation and disinformation in the name of political agendas. So it's not necessarily the corporate and the government merging together. It's merely just the corporations even trying to hold themselves, basically saving face in front of, because the Democratic Party among voters and supporters is the majority party. So in seeing in that, they're mainly trying to protect themselves in the market, and then also trying to protect themselves from further court actions. And that's why Trump wanted to attack Section 230, so that Republicans would have more leverage to hold corporations accountable from them blocking their attempts to spread misinformation. So, yeah, that's super cool, Tucker.
Subtle indicators. These are fire alarms, and everyone can see them. No one seems to care at the moment. In the last week, CNN and the Washington Post have called for Fox News to be shut down by force. Why? Because they don't like our views, so we should be banned.
But again, and there's a study that says anybody who views Fox News is less informed than someone who consumes no news whatsoever. It was published like 2 years ago. Oh, wow. Yeah, longer than that. It came out in 2012. Watching only Fox News makes you less informed than watching no news at all. Let's see. Let me see where the... it came from Fairleigh Dickinson University's newest Public Mind survey. So, yeah, there's where that comes from. It's an old conversation, and I feel like they've only gotten worse under Trump. Trump was a third of the misinformation coming out about coronavirus at the height of the pandemic. So let that be known. And, Fox News regurgitated almost everything that Trump wanted to say and do. They were even worried back at the early days of the pandemic whether or not they were liable for a lot of the lies that they helped the president spread. So Fox News does need to hold accountability, and we need to start holding them to the fire when they spread this misinformation. But so far, nobody seems to actually be taking action on that because, I don't know, fascism can really only operate with two wings. You need the supposed opposition party to appear as if they're against what the other party is doing, but really they work hand in hand in order to keep the populace at each other's throats while they continue working together to ostracize the working class. So,
in a normal country, reasonable people, including other journalists, might stand up and say, hold on, censorship is wrong. Censorship only serves the powerful. But they've said nothing because they agree. Meanwhile, our elected officials become openly authoritarian and no one pushes back. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser said she would like...
I mean, 4 years of Trump and Fox News pushed back none. So...
the National Guard to place crew-served machine guns, belt-fed 50 cals, around the city. This in addition to 26,000 federal troops, more than Abraham Lincoln had defending the Capitol in 1864. But we need those, she said, because Trump voters are that dangerous. What did the massive infrastructure of professional libertarians in Washington say to this? Nothing. They were silent. What did Mitch McConnell say, the Republican leader of the Senate? Nothing. He was too busy attacking Trump voters for being the real threat. Other members of Congress on the other side just tore off the...
Mitch McConnell, just kind of waited to see how everything was going to turn out. And once he finally realized that Trump didn't have enough evidence nor, enough strength to actually overturn the election, after 6 weeks of silence, Mitch McConnell finally acknowledged that Joe Biden won the election. So, Mitch McConnell is just a slippery worm who just goes wherever the wind is blowing, honestly. So, yeah. It's a fair attack, honestly. It's a fair attack on Mitch McConnell, that slippery little slime bag.
The mask completely and launched into open race hate on television. That's not an exaggeration. We wish it was. Here's Congressman Jamal Bowman explaining that the real problem with this country is white people. They're the threat to progress.
But this is a chance for all of us in Congress to sort of begin at a new baseline and stop spreading the myth of American exceptionalism and accept the fact that this is exactly who we are, and this is exactly who we've been throughout our country's history. Whenever there's social progress, there's white backlash.
The story here is not that one member of Congress said this on.
I don't really see him blaming like white people for everything like Tucker Carlson had alleged, but like in the name of Black Lives Matter, a lot of, mostly white supporters, there were color, very multiracial people who said Blue Lives Matter, but it was predominantly white people who said Blue Lives Matter in order to hurt the Black Lives Matter movement. So, and even Martin Luther King had said that he, kind of was weary of the white liberals because most of the time they will side with the status quo and the government in order to, slow down the progress of human and civil rights for multiracial people, mainly because of like the churning of the narrative from the media and from people in positions of power who are against those movements themselves. So and they tend to mostly be white, and it's not like white people are entirely hurting the progress of this nation. It's just they tend to be inside of those ideologies that do.
On television, the story is that many members of Congress and members of our media say this on television every single day, attack huge groups of Americans on the basis of their skin color, and nobody says anything. Nobody pushes back, as if there are no consequences to talking that way. But there are. How long can people keep talking like that and keep acting like this, irresponsibly, crazily, before something breaks? Before one of those 74 million hunted terrorist Trotskyite wreckers we keep hearing about becomes so overwrought and paranoid from watching demagogues like Jamal Bowman attack him on MSNBC that he does something truly awful that can't be taken back. And then the cycle accelerates radically, and an awful lot of people get hurt.
So what I find fascinating is that we spent 15 minutes of Tucker Carlson telling you why you should be angry at the Democratic Party, and is like, and how you're being oppressed by, large power structures inside the United States. And he's alleging that it is their fault of, making Americans so mad that they would take action, possible violent action. How long do we have until they break? Even though he's literally up here almost inciting this kind of feeling inside of Americans. So I find that interesting that he's able to incite the feeling of oppression inside of Americans and then basically shift the blame onto the Democratic Party, which is what we're going to see throughout this entire year through every action that Joe Biden does. If he starts the construction of the building of the wall, then that's an attack on Americans because he's supporting immigrants more than he is supporting Americans. It's this is something that's going to continue to build.
That's where this is going. Everyone knows it. That's where this will go until and unless someone responsible within the Democratic Party appears and puts a stop to it, and soon. It's time for the victors to accept their victory, to forgive the team they beat, and to move on. You won. Be happy.
Yeah, but like since the day that Joe Biden won and up until now, they've been denying and trying to build the idea that Trump has a chance. And up until January 6th, when all shit hit the fan, that's when it became clear Trump didn't have a chance. And then they pivoted like, oh, it's so clear that you won. Oh man, you should just, accept the results. And it's like, dude, you guys have been the ones fighting and denying. That's you, Tucker. But yeah, so we have another segment to get into, but first a short break so that I can properly upload all of this stuff. So, try not to go anywhere, but if you do, I hope it's to get a glass of water, to wash all of this down with. So we will be right back after this brief, shift change, I guess. I don't know, change of the guard, except the guard will be me still, so I don't know. But we'll be right back.